everyone, this is Sally from Room for Art, making a video about how to use your latest art pack, which is the felt. And this is some of the raw felt that I have. Yours is in much neater, prettier balls. To do wet felting, which creates a kind of piece of fabric that can be like a piece of art. You can sew onto it. It's quite flexible. Basically it's made by layering up thin layers of the raw wool that you have been given and using hot water and friction to get them to shrink together to make a piece of fabric. So here are a couple that I made yesterday in the class that I did, and I'll make one for you just now. So we'll pop these to one side and I'll show you what I have. So first you can see I have a towel down on my work surface. That's because we're going to be using some water, so we want to catch all the water to make sure we don't end up with a really wet surface later on. And I also have my felt, or when it's in this raw form it can be called wool roving, and it's kind of like little bits of carded, which means brushed felt. You can see I've got a few different colours here. I'm going to use maybe like 3 or 4 different colours for today's one. I also have my bubble wrap. You should have got 2 pieces of bubble wrap. This is just recycled bubble wrap from packing things. You can use it, but it basically creates a little bit of a bumpy surface for friction to occur when we're doing our felting. So you want 1 piece for the bottom with your bubbles facing upwards, and then once we've laid up our felt, we pop another piece on top with the bubbles facing downwards. We'll come to that in a bit. And the last thing I have is a bowl of warm or hot soapy water. You basically want it to be as hot as you can have it whilst not being uncomfortable to put your hands in. The heat helps the wool to shrink together. Kind of imagine if you ever accidentally put a wool jumper into the wash. The heat and the friction help the fibres shrink together and knit together to create your fabric. So hot water is really useful, and the soap helps to just give everything a little bit of ability to move around, slide around and stuff like that. I put maybe 4 or 5 drops of washing up liquid in this water. But you'll be able to tell later on if it's soapy enough, and if not, you can always add a couple of dabs of washing up liquid straight onto your felt. But we'll get into the making just now. So I'm going to start by taking some of my wool. I think yours came in some lovely little knots that looked a bit more like this. So you can unravel it so that you've got a kind of long, what's called a skein, a long thick bit of wool. And what we want to do for felting is we want to take small amounts of the wool and layer them on top of each other. So I'm going to separate it a little bit at the top by just pulling the fibres apart. You can see that this is made up of all these little fibres that come together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate it out a little bit side to side with my fingers, and then I'm going to just start to pull gently up from the top, and I'm going to start to take off bits of the wool. So you can see there, it's quite a thin, fine piece of wool. We're going to use quite thin layers to build up our piece, so you want to use quite thin layers. If it's too thick, then the felt won't be able to properly come together later on. So take your pieces. If they start off a little bit more kind of like a lump that's a bit more like this, it's quite kind of close together, then just again tease out your fibres so that they become a little bit more see-through, almost like a net or something like that. You can see there, it's quite see-through. That's the kind of thing we're going for when we're starting to layer up our felt. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start laying on pieces like that onto my bubble wrap. And I'm going to start with the first layer is going to be pieces of felt where the fibres are laying up and down. So like that. And then the next layer I'm going to do will be the fibres going across. That helps to just add a little bit of difference to the textures so that when they come to be felted together, they lock in even more. So small bits. If a piece feels too big as well, you could always split it. And I'm creating a kind of background using some white. You don't have to do that. You could go straight in with some colour, and this could all be different colours mixed together. Maybe we'll add a little bit of colour in to get us started. Get some of this orange. And you'll find when you're doing the felting that it takes a little bit of trial and error to get the effect that you want. So the first couple of times you do it, try not to worry too much about the end result, and instead perhaps focus on the way that it feels, the softness of the felt, the colours of each one, and kind of enjoy the experimental element of this. Whoops. Because like any new technique, the first couple of times you do it, don't expect anything that's going to be kind of perfect, because it's not what we're after at this point. So now I'm going to start my second layer, doing my fibres going across the way this time. And I might add in a little bit of colour as well to start layering that up. So work quite intuitively, go with what you like. Let yourself be playful. There you go. It's kind of like pulling Velcro apart or something like that. So if it's hard to pull the fibres apart from the felt balls, then that probably means you're trying to pull too much off at one time. So you can reduce your amount when you're pulling it off. And we're just building up layers and layers of colour. Obviously, the more layers you add, the more thick your final piece of fabric will become. I would say you want at least 3 layers and no more than maybe 6 or 7 when you're first starting. We don't want it to be too difficult for us to felt things together the first time, otherwise that could be a little bit disheartening. And also, when you first start felting, the action that is required can be a little bit exhausting. So the thinner your felt, the kind of quicker it will felt together. So bear that in mind in your first go. I'm adding a few little kind of flashes of colour by re-twisting some of the felt together to create these more kind of compact bits of colour, if you can see what I mean. So you can add some kind of chunkier bits in. You just have to be aware that they will stay a little bit more separate than perhaps the rest of the piece. So now I'm going to start doing my third layer. Thinking about what's already there as well, perhaps things that might want a little more colour. And this third layer is going up and down. So the reason that this works as a technique is because the wool that we're using, it's all sheep's wool, and so it has a very special natural texture. So if you were to put some of these fibres underneath the microscope, you'd be able to see that this really special texture has got like tiny little hooks all over the felt fibres. And so what happens when you start to rub those together is that those hooks kind of lock together. The more you rub them, the more they become kind of tangled up, and that creates your felt fabric. So it's very different from weaving or knitting or anything like that, where you're kind of very, very orderly layering up your fibres to create a fabric. This is much more chaotic, much more kind of organic, less predictable, which is important. I always think it's a good thing to remember when you're doing something with felt, that there's only so much you can control, especially with wet felting. Some of you might have seen some other pieces of felting done where it's much more kind of precise, but that is often done with what's called needle felting, which is much more kind of small scale, use a little tiny needle to put things together. Whereas this, there's definitely an element of chance and experimentation. So I would say lean into that. All right then, so we've got our build up, and I'm going to just pat it down. And then I'm going to move the rest of my felt away because I don't want that to get wet. And now I can start to apply my water. And you can notice that I haven't gone all the way to the edge of my bubble wrap for now. I'm going to keep it quite small, and that means it'll felt quicker. And also that means it won't fall out of the edge, or one bit won't be more felted than the other. It's nice and encased inside its little bubble wrap house. So I'm just going to start to pick up kind of droplets of the water and just sprinkle it all over the wool. And this is why we have the towel down, you can see, because the water will start to kind of seep out and things like that, but we want to make sure that all of the wool is wet. So I'm just very carefully pressing it down with my fingers to try and get all of the wool wet, to spread out that water. And you can see the bubbles from the soap in my water, so that's good. And once we start to apply even more friction to it, then we will see more bubbles coming out, more suds. And like I said, if you don't see the suds starting to appear in your water when you start to felt your work, then maybe add a little bit of extra water, a little bit of extra soap. So that's nice and wet just now, and I have my water if I need to add any more. I don't think I will. I'm going to move that away for now. I'm going to pop my second piece of bubble wrap on top again, making sure that the whole thing is covered. Some people use netting, like a net fabric on top of their felting instead of a second piece of bubble wrap, so that they have a little bit more control and they can see it better. But you know, the bubble wrap is a nice recycled material and it works just as well. So if you have netting, you could try that. I often found that the netting ended up getting felted into the fabric. I don't quite know why, but so I prefer to use bubble wrap. So what we're going to do is, now it's encased in there, we're just going to start to gently agitate the whole thing, kind of all over, just using little wiggling motions with your hands to just get it started. And again, you'll start to see your soap produce its suds, and just flattening it all down like that. And then what I'm going to do once it's kind of flat and I've started to produce the suds is I'm going to roll the whole thing into a little tube from one end to the other. So roll it up into a wee felty sausage. And you can see now, especially why we've got the towel down, because all the water is going to start to squirt out of the edges. And I'm just rolling it back and forth. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on, but I'm just gently rolling it back and forth. And what's happening inside the sausage is that the bubbles from the bubble wrap are kind of rubbing against the felt and getting those little hooks to hook together. And the heat from the water and from your hands as well will be starting to shrink those fibres together. Now, a sensible thing would be to have a rubber band or 2 rubber bands or string on the ends to like make sure this doesn't fall apart, but that's the bit I always forget, and they're not completely essential. As you can see, you can still rub back and forth without them. You just might have to re-roll up your bubble wrap every now and again. So you probably want to do this for a small piece like this, maybe like 5 minutes or 3 minutes. You can always check how the progress is going after a wee while. And it's a nice textural thing to be doing, you know, if you want to do something mindless but productive, or if you want to let out a bit of anger, you could really go to town with your rubbing, get some of the tension out of your body, get some of the stress out of your head. Give this a good squeeze and a rub. Or if you want to do it much slower, you can do it slowly and different. So whatever feels good. And if you struggle with a lot of repetitive movement or anything, you can do a little bit, leave it, come back to it, add a bit more warm water and soap and do a little bit more. So there's no hurry. to get this done. As you can imagine, a bigger piece of felting would need more rubbing, but we started small, so it's not going to take too long. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm rubbing all along, not just at the ends, but in the middle as well. So I'm moving my hands about just to make sure everything gets felted. I'm kind of re-rolling this every now and again. And look, you can see all the soap coming out of the ends there, which is totally fine. Just means that the friction is happening. If the bubbles are being made, then the felting is happening. So that's good to know. And some felters use things like bamboo rolls as well to add an extra element of friction. Or you could roll your bubble wrap package around a rolling pin or something if that is easier for you to roll with. Lots of people have their own different techniques and different things that they use. I find that this works fine for me. I might do one last really big roll all over, and then we can check how the progress is going. And there's a very simple test you can do for your felting to see if it's starting to felt together. So let's have a wee look. I've unrolled it, and I'm gonna reveal it there. So you can see it's shrunk, and the fabric is starting to have edges, and the colours have all kind of tightened up. Bring this a bit closer so you can see. So that means that it's definitely working. You can see there are some fibres coming off the ends here which still need felting in, but generally we're going good. It's working. And something that you can do to check on the progress is you can try to pinch. I'll do it with my other hand so you can see. Try to pinch a bit of the fibres, and if they come away really easily, then they need more felting. This is definitely getting there. You can see that the fibres are coming away a bit, but it's not easy to pull them off. So that means that the kind of hooks are all starting to hook together. So I'm going to do a little bit more on this one. You could add more hot water if you wanted at this point, or more soap, but I'm just going to get right in there. And the more friction you apply, the more time you spend rubbing, the more your felt will shrink together and felt together and become kind of smaller and denser. So you can play about with how long you roll for, see how tiny you can shrink your pieces up, or you can leave them to be quite loose and they'll be more kind of translucent and a bit less kind of dense. So that's something you can experiment with as well. We talked about in my class the other day whether or not you could put flat felting in the washing machine to do this bit for you. You can put things like felt balls in the washing machine to be made, but I've never done it with a flat piece, so that might be something that I can do a little experiment with and see if it works. My worry would be that it would get tossed about so much that the kind of placement of the felt would end up being kind of lost, but it might still work. But if you're getting tired with the felting action, take a break and then come back to it. The felting kind of action won't stop happening if you don't do it all straight away. So there we go. Let's have a little looky. So you can see it's shrunk even more, and it's getting even more kind of colourful, and the colours are all tightening up, so they're becoming a bit bolder. And what you can do if, you know, maybe there are some edges that aren't quite how you want them to be, or it's getting into a funny colour, is you can get a little bit more of your water, splish a bit more of it on, and then be a bit more intentional with where you're felting. So now that it's all one piece of fabric, you can just felt straight onto it, and you can perhaps felt in a corner, give a corner a bit of a rub if it needs shrinking in, taming, if those extra fibres need to be brought in. Circular motions work well. And as you can imagine, the soap is kind of helping things to not just stick together. It's like providing a little bit of slippiness. And this part you can kind of experiment with. If you like the raggedy edges, then just leave them be. Or you can be a bit more intentional about it. And you'll notice that your pieces kind of can end up being quite funny shapes. I quite like that. I like the kind of raw edges. But once it's dried, you could always cut those off if you want it to be a bit neater. Or you can also use your final stages of rubbing to make them a bit more intentional. So I'm going to stop for now because it's made a piece of fabric. As you can see, it's quite difficult to pick up the fibres. They're all really nicely felted together, and you can give it a pull and you can see that it's pretty sturdy. You know, it's going to be a little bit malleable whilst it's wet, but it's pretty sturdy. And yeah, the more that you felt, the more kind of it'll tighten up and become a smaller thing. I quite like it being quite thin and translucent. I don't know if you can see that the colour is being really highlighted by the window that's next to me. So you can make these lovely translucent pieces, or you can make them thicker. The more layers you add, the thicker it'll be, but the longer it'll take to felt. So that's your basic wet felting, and what you would do now is you would give this a rinse. If you want to tighten it up even more, you could rinse it in hot water first, and then at the end always rinse it in cold water, because that will just set everything and make sure that it's all staying in the same place and stuff like that. So give it a rinse in the cold water, get all that soap off and let it dry, and then you'll end up with these pieces of fabric which are really soft and gentle and lovely. And you can use them just as they are. They could be pieces, you know, you can make a series like this, or you could cut them up and use them for things. You know, you could even start to build your own soft sculptures out of them. They're quite lovely and malleable, so you can bend them around and do all sorts with them. And they're really, really lovely items. So that is wet felting, a little introduction to wet felting. Have a little play, see what happens. It's really intuitive once you kind of know the basics, which is layer, wet, soap, rub, and then check. After that, give all sorts a try. You can trap threads in there, old bits of yarn, even small bits of fabric. As long as you kind of layer your felt on top of it, it'll trap it in there. But that is an introduction to wet felting. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy having a go with it. All right, see you later.